Tourette's podcast is not a medical advice show. It's a show about experiences. In the course of that, we may talk about medications or therapies or stories from the doctor's office, but don't mistake any of that for medical advice or direction. It's not. Get that only from people or places licensed or certified to give it, not from a massively fun and action-packed podcast about our life experiences, such as...
But after we cashed out, and I feel as though the most populous area in a supermarket is the cashier area. Before I left, I just felt a huge premonitory urge, like through my body, and I screamed, "I have coronavirus." And I mean, the looks of people, you can see their eyes through the masks, and oh my gosh.
This is Tourette's podcast, made possible with support of the Tourette Association of America and part of the Geeks Rising Network. I want to read you something from Tourette.org, the website of the Tourette Association of America. If you go there right now and click on diversity and inclusion, right there in the middle of the page, here's what comes up, and I'll just read it here. Tourette syndrome is a lifelong condition that affects all races, ethnicities, genders, and ages. We understand that intersectionality, which is the intersection of identities, gender, racial, ethnic, sexual, religious, disability, within the community creates added challenges that are real and pose a threat to equal access and care. In addition, we recognize and embrace the diverse makeup of our constituencies and acknowledge that in order to fulfill our mission, we must better serve all populations affected by Tourette syndrome and related tic disorders. Your voice matters. Please continue raising awareness, sharing your stories, and making change. Our goal is to ensure that everyone impacted receives equal access to programs, resources, and support, as well as treatment and care regardless of age, race, gender, sexuality, ethnicity, religion, or income. And it goes on to a bulleted list of things TAA has done to get there, including a reinvigorated diversity committee and increasing multilingual providers, educators, volunteers, staff, and programming on a national level. Feedback from you here over the podcast has covered these topics more and more, and I've really taken to heart the requests for additional voices, which I've always wanted, but I think the podcast has just kind of developed in this piecemeal kind of way, where I'm just kind of talking to whoever wants to have a conversation. But there is a demand for more voices, including the need for more teenage voices on the podcast. When this podcast started out, there was a lot of focus on the adult population, adults with Tourette syndrome, who sometimes or even often felt like they were just not being included. And that a lot of the programming was child-focused, and that's great. There should be child-focused and parent-focused programming, but in the bandwidth, there were a lot of adults with TS who wanted to tell their story, which was quickly clear in the feedback here, like during the first season. But as time has gone on and the podcast has grown and become a part of different households, different walks, there's been a growing request for more teenage voices, which we've included in past seasons, but not to a great degree. And so we're continuing the attack of the teens on this episode with additional important themes. So last week we had Shyla, who was fantastic, by the way. Go back and listen to that episode. And this week we've got Hara. And I'll say get ready for a fun episode. A lot of laughing, really interesting story. This episode is just fun. I mean, there's some heavy stuff we get into, important stuff, but the tone here is really... Wait, hang on. Let me look up a synonym for fun. Lively, convivial. A convivial discussion coming up with Hara. In addition to the life lesson crash course of getting into your teenage years, Hara also talks about cultural dynamics, being of West Indian descent, and maybe differing standards for acceptance or access to conversations about what TS is. And this leads to a really, really cool story with her dad. I love it. It's one of my favorite about-face stories. I also show my ignorance to how the sport of curling works. Hara, being a Canadian resident, sets me straight. It's a really funny, if not jarring, story about trying to get a diagnosis. And then intersectionality is also an important part of the conversation here, and we're going to hear why very clearly at the end. Oh, and if the name Hara sounds familiar, that's the name behind this Tourette's Podcast Hall of Fame moment from earlier this season.
I listen to the TS podcast. I listen to the Tourette podcast.
And I like the concept of finding your beacon, or a beacon or a hero, or someone on the public stage out there who expresses a philosophy that makes sense of things to you, like things you've been trying to convey or realize how to put. And Hara has a really great example of that. But we start out just kind of jamming on some current events, and Hara does a really great job relating things happening to the the perspective, so to speak, of people with Tourette, or at least what kind of perspective Tourette can afford people who have it, and when it comes to very human issues currently in public focus. And we'll pick it up from there. So I'm all set over here. How's it going, by the way?
Everything's going pretty well. Here, I live in Canada, so close to Toronto.
Yeah.
And there's been a heat warning, so it's close to, well, we use Celsius, but 30, so it's really, really hot over here.
Oh man, yeah. It's awful over here right now. It's a very muggy high 90s where I'm living, and
oh yeah, is it difficult to breathe? Sometimes I go outside and I'm like, I can't even breathe out here. It's crazy.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely difficult for me to breathe in here. I'm up in the Tourette's podcast studio. Like right now, the air conditioning is having a really hard time keeping up, and so I have this like fan pointed at my feet, and so it doesn't hit the microphone. Brutal in here.
Insane.
Do you have any questions or anything like that?
Well, first one is about you, kind of. What is it like in North Carolina, where you live? Because the U.S. is kind of like a mystery to me.
Yeah, so North Carolina, I guess right now, current events wise, we're like a Confederate state, and we were, part of the Confederacy during the Civil War, and
Wow.
So right now, all these Confederate statues are being pulled down either by protesters or by governments who are saying, let's get these things out of here, just because they remind so many people of racism. And so it's really kind of neat to see in North Carolina that all of these southern towns that have historically protected their monuments are now pulling them down and saying, we don't want to see these things anymore. So there's definitely this like feeling of change right now in North Carolina. It's kind of neat.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting how that kind of ripples into over here in Canada, because we're seeing a lot of protests happening, and we have our own set of issues that we're starting to fight as well. And I wish I was a little more, I wish I knew more about the topic, and I wish I could talk about it a little more on an educated standpoint. But I mean, seeing how that ripples here is very interesting to me.
And it exists here too, but is Canada, does it have to do with like the First Nations or?
A lot of it is about Indigenous and First Nations,
yeah,
and the fact that we're living on their land, and a lot of things we want to build is going to be building on land that they have owned for a long time. It's important to be mindful of like genocide that's happened in different cultures, and how hard it is to be different when people are trying to impede on that land, on your culture. It's unfortunate. And I think that like coming from a Tourette background and understanding injustices in our community, and neurotypical and not neurotypical but neurodivergent communities as well, it makes you see it from a different lens.
This is kind 100%. Of a good point. So I've been recording this, but we haven't necessarily formally launched into the interview, but Mom. We're talking about some good stuff, and I think maybe we should just kind of pick it up from there. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Tell us your name and the general part of the world you live in, and also how old you are.
Okay, so my name is Hara, or I go by Hara in the group on Facebook. It's way easier to say. I'm 17 years old. And I live in the GTA, so general Toronto area. So I don't live too far from the city.
Are you native to that area?
I was born here. My family, they come from Guyana. They're West Indian. So I come from a South Asian West Indian background.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah.
What you were just saying about having something like Tourette and the lens that it kind of affords you, that's a really great point, and it's something that I've been kind of appreciating more and more and more over the past, I think, few seasons. How does that affect you in your daily life? I mean, for me, it's all about kind of slowing down my judgment of other people and kind of letting people be what they are if there's not a problem. And if there is some sort of perceived disagreement between myself and somebody else, it kind of slows down my judgment of maybe what they've been through or where they're coming from. So I don't, it's you want to give people second and third chances so you can understand them better before you judge who or what they are.
Yeah, and it's hard to put yourself in somebody else's experience when it's something that you haven't dealt with yourself. And it's easy to be empathetic and sympathetic, but understanding those struggles, it's hard for somebody without Tourette's to understand what it's like to have Tourette syndrome. And it took a long time for my friends to understand. They were champs at it. My family took a while as well. But I think no matter what adversities you go through, whether you're, I go by they, them pronouns. I'm a queer teenager. I have Tourette syndrome. I am a person of color. I think each of those lenses that you add kind of helps you deal with the adversity in life. And that's kind of the way that I've learned to cope with my symptoms and the way that I walk through life in a way.
Mm-hmm.
Every single experience you have adds a bit to your story and the way that you perceive the world.
That's kind of a conversation now where people are like, there are all these new pronouns that we have to learn. And, why do I have to say that? Why do I have to refer to you as they, them? And the point that you were making is so important that unless I'm you, I don't really know kind of inside and out how that feels, how you feel, why that's important to you. Why that means more to you than it might to somebody else, and how for me it's not necessarily any real burden to kind of meet you on that and be okay with it.
By meeting somebody else's needs, it's not like it's taking away from yours.
Exactly, and we do it so many other ways, with so many other people. But and usually the people who object to that kind of thing or something are the same people who want you to do something else for them that's roughly the same thing. Like everybody wants to be understood. Some people want to be left alone, and I respect that. But everybody wants to be understood or at least taken seriously for who they are or who they say they are. If you don't have that, then that just adds so much unnecessary stress that, and if you think about kind of like the bank of stress or
my bank is huge. Yeah. I invest in it all the time. Yes.
And it's like, these, if we could concentrate our ire or, like what we object to, I feel like everything could be so much easier and so much more softened. And especially for, if you have something like TS, stress is a pretty important factor, right? I mean, that can determine, what kind of tick day you're having or where your anxiety goes, or, I mean.
And yeah, sometimes I find that I have bad tick days. Before COVID, when I was in school, because I just finished grade 12 and I just graduated high school, I'd find that I'd not have tick days, but good and bad tick hours. So I'd have to say it hour by hour because maybe I'm okay in class and then I go to lunch and I'm having like coprolalia fits because of how much I was suppressing. And I realize how much I was suppressing. It's very interesting in that way. I agree.
Huh. Yeah. So when did this stuff crop up for you? Have you experienced tics since you were really young, or when were you diagnosed, or what's your story with that?
My story, I think personally is very interesting, but I just think I'm an interesting person in general. I think I've been experiencing tics as early as in grade 5, so grade 1. I remember having a tic where I'd like clench my leg and buttock area. And I remember coughing a lot. And whenever I asked my mom about it, she kind of is like, well, that wasn't tics. That was just like you coughing. Maybe you had like bronchitis or something, but I don't buy it altogether. But if you talk to my mom, she'd say that the first time that she saw me ticking was my going into grade 7. So I was going into a new school. I was starting middle school. And she noticed that as I was talking to my friends, I started having head tics. And my Tourette syndrome at the beginning was very, very mild. So it's nothing compared to what it was or what it is now. I used to have head tics. I still have tics where I kind of throw my arms. And I had one vocal tic and it kind of sounded kind of like a coffee vocalization thing. So
Hmm.
that's what it was then. But as I continued through high school, grade 9, 10, 11, 12, 10, 11, 12 is when it started really picking up, and I started having more vocalizations. And I don't know if it was the added stress. Cool. I started developing coprolalia and tic attacks, and I would be problematic in class starting in grade 11, 12. And I was also my school prime minister, and
Hmm.
it's a whole it was a lot of stresses coming in. I was dealing with a lot family wise because my grandparents were getting evicted from their house. It was a lot
Oh
of
God.
things happening at once, and I
Yeah.
guess it just manifested in tics. Woo! And
Wow.
the Tourette syndrome that I had before, and yeah,
Wow. Yeah. So
it's
that's a lot at once.
100%.
And so your tics
I
have gotten worse over the years, or has it
I
kind of
found they've
fluctuated? Or
Yeah, they've definitely. It's weird because usually people say that by 17, they find that their Tourette's has gotten better and that the tics have diminished. But
Mhm.
for me, it's kind of an opposite. It's been kind of like a crescendo for me. Um, I was I started exhibiting tics at age 11, so going into grade 7. But I wasn't diagnosed until the age of 15 because nobody understood my tics. Like I had the kind where wouldn't even be ticking in a doctor's office. It was
Yeah.
pretty mild.
Yeah.
So it went under the radar for years until I was diagnosed finally in grade 11 at 15. And that diagnosis, the story of that diagnosis is in itself uh, very eventful, the way that I put it.
Yeah. Tell it.
Okay, so I've been to numerous doctors from over the years. So I'd go in, I'm like, oh, well, I have head tics and stuff like that, and they're like, well, you're not doing it now, so it mustn't be that bad. Oh, my general practitioner, doctor, was like, well, you just have to get out there and get hit by a ball, play a sport, and I was like, oh, yeah, sure, okay. I had a
What?
I had a pediatric gynecologist ask me, "Are you happy in life?" And I've had a lot of questions like that. Um, it so I was I was having these tics. I was exhibiting a lot of anxiety, and
Yeah.
I was like, "What?" For a while I was a mystery to myself in a way.
Huh.
Uh, so going through high school, grade 10, 11, my tics were worsening. And I had gone to another walk-in clinician, and he was like, "Okay, I'll refer you to a neurologist." And I said, "Okay, that sounds good." Finally, so I had to wait a while for the neurologist appointment.
Yeah.
In Toronto. So I go into the office, and it's a very small white office, and I'm like a 15-year-old, and I'm like, "Whoa, this is so nerve-wracking, but maybe my story will be heard, right?" Um, so, so, so I walk in, and the doctor is very, very cold, and he is kind of rude, and I'm like,
Mm.
oh my gosh, and I'm kind of feeling anxious, and I'm not being as open as I know I should be, but it's okay. I'm still saying the tics. He asked me a question which was like, okay, of your vocalizations, how many would you say that you do in like a minute? And I'm like, oh my god, I've never counted. Oh, I'm sure I have a bunch. So I
Ticks
was
per
like,
minute.
yeah, ticks per minute. Oh my god, I can't even say it.
TPM.
TPM. And I was like, okay, shoot. Okay, let's say like, I don't know, 20 per minute. And he was like, that's impossible. That would be like one every 3 seconds. And I was like, oh my gosh, what am I supposed
Impossible.
to say? And I think I tick up to 1,000 times per day now. So I mean,
Yeah.
um, so I mean, I don't know. It was out there for a 15-year-old who has like no sense of time. So I was getting very anxious, but it was both my parents were there. I was nervous. The doctor was kind of rude, and I was like, okay, okay. And he got kind of quiet, and I'm like, okay, what do you think? Oh, what do you think it is as of right now? And he said, well, as of right now, it looks like you may be on the Tourette spectrum. And I was like, oh, okay. And I've read about it, but I've never really thought that had my name under it. I don't know. And I was like, okay, well, how can we check? How can we figure it out?
Mm-hmm.
And he looked at me and he was like, no, I am telling you, you are on the Tourette spectrum. And he starts yelling at me. And
God.
what do you say to that? What are you supposed to say to this doctor who's finally giving you an answer that you've been looking for years? And then he starts yelling at you. And then
God.
I'm 4'11". Through my little body, I just said, oh, okay.
Yeah, I'll stand over here in my Tourette spectrum.
Yes, which is a very vague diagnosis. And it was very vague on the sheet that he gave me as well. But I wasn't very happy, even though I finally had an answer. It was a very vague answer, and I didn't feel like, wait, does that mean that I have Tourette syndrome?
A terribly delivered answer.
A terribly delivered answer. And in the car ride home, my parents and I were really quiet because what an experience. And I was like, wow, that guy was very strange, was he? And he was like, my dad was like, yeah, very strange. We don't need to listen to anything he said. And I was like, wait, hold up.
Oh, man.
What? So from that day on until I turned, until I was 16, 17, we just, my family kind of just thought that he had given me a Tourette diagnosis because that's what I wanted to hear. And that's where a lot of problems lied for until I turned 16, so my grade 12 year, when they started picking up. Yeah.
Wow. So what was your family's and that's an amazing story, by the way, because I mean that if that's what your interface was with medicine or with doctors, it even if you want a second opinion, that it even makes that, kind of undesirable. I mean, it's just, it adds anxiety to a situation where you're trying to kind of make peace with whatever you have and figure out how to work with it. And then being just kind of barked at is
100%. And then I wasn't even diagnosed with my comorbids. He just said, do you want medication? And I was like, well, no, I don't think so. And he's like, okay, then, well, we'll just get you an MRI to make sure you don't have like a tumor or anything. And then we'll send you home. But I have exactly. And I have a onslaught of comorbids that I wasn't diagnosed with until I turned 17, which was in December of 2019. So just recently.
Wow. So in the meantime, how was your family kind of interacting with your tics, or when it became maybe part of the conversation, or did they have their own thoughts about, you mentioned the bronchitis thing, but kind of as things were advancing and then them noticing your head jerking and things like that.
Yeah.
Where were they going with it?
It was mostly my mom taking care of it. Sometimes she'd say to family like, oh, look at her. She's like twitching her head. And my family would be like, what? No, she's not. And they'd like start staring at me and kind of like, oh, there it is. Like, because at the time it was really mild, and it would happen mostly when I was nervous or excited, kind of like how tics normally pick up. But when it started getting more severe, and I was ticking, now I tick pretty much every 3-5 seconds. That was really
impossible.
Hard. It was very hard. It was very hard at the beginning, of how family would deal with it, how I would deal with it. My family got really mad. At the beginning, they weren't very approving at all. But they got there eventually, which I'm very happy with. But it was very, very difficult to deal with, and that maybe why it got so bad. That disapprovingness, because neurodiversity is very strange in the colored community, and especially in South Asian culture. Something we don't talk about too much, not something that we're very open with. I have aunts that deal with headaches and anxiety, but it's not like they talk about it a lot. And the fact that I was exhibiting tics, which are loud, and that was so new and different.
Had you seen anything like that in your family before? Because, there's that sort of, hereditary genetic kind of conversation with TS. Have you seen anything similar to that in your family?
It's nothing, not Tourette syndrome. I mean, my brother had like transient blinking tics as a kid. Like his grade 1 teacher was like, "Oh, by the way, he's blinking a lot," but that didn't turn into Tourette syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
And I have one cousin who has OCD tics. So he has OCD and he has some tics, but it's not Tourette syndrome.
Gotcha. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
but it was
Well, yeah.
very new. Yeah.
And all that kind of, fits together one way or the other. And I've seen that in my family too, where there are some other things that seem to kind of make sense in context with my Tourette syndrome, I guess, without really seeing any clear cases of TS elsewhere in my family. But so you mentioned kind of the cultural dynamics. What do you have any thoughts on that about kind of maybe why it's viewed differently in your background, or why something like TS is not quite directly acknowledged, or what are your thoughts on that?
That's a great question. Oh, and I can't pinpoint it to one thing specifically. Like there's no writing saying it's impossible for people to have this. I think that it's one thing that's not always talked about, but it's also, I think, something about perfection in a way. How in a
Perfection and
brown
weakness.
in a brown family you want to be the perfect child, and like the pride that people would that would be in people's faces when I'd say, oh, I want to maybe go into medicine, maybe being a doctor. They look at me like they were proud, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That thing that you wanted to achieve to make the people around you happy, and then you start exhibiting tics, and they're like, well, that's something that's not wrong with you. That's something that's not good. And when I told my grandparents, that was kind of the first thing that they would say. That's something that's not good. It's something wrong with you. And
okay.
I had to learn to have a stronger mentality to deal with language like that. And I've developed that because of I think it's for the better. That has been one of the hardest things to deal with, and Tourette syndrome as a whole has been the hardest thing I've ever had to deal with. But I've built ways to cope and deal with it, and I think in the end I'm a stronger person for it. So
what was it that you think made your family come around, so to speak, and kind of take it for, or see it for what it is, and kind of see it maybe through your lens?
The fact that it wasn't stopping was a big one. In grade 11 and in grade 12, when it was starting to pick up, it wasn't stopping. And for months, there was a continued rhetoric of, well, just say that in your head. Why are you doing that so much? My sister tried to force feed me edible, which is like a chocolate marijuana thing. Treat is a bad word for that. But yeah, so she tried to force feed that to me. And I'm like, no, I used to have a lot of tic attacks or tic fits where I'd just be screaming and I'm studying and I'm crying and I'm trying to study and I'm like hitting my sheet with my pen, and now I have a hole in my paper that I'm supposed to hand in to my teacher tomorrow. And yeah, it was difficult. My dad had a hard time with it at the beginning too. Like we'd be driving, and in Canada it snows, obviously, and there were fat snowflakes, and he was like, "Whoa, the snowflakes are really fat." And I had a tic, which was like, "Don't fat shame the snowflakes," which is so funny. But he was like, "Oh my gosh, don't say that, to stop. You're distracting me." And my family had put me in curling, which is another very Canadian sport. With brooms and ice. And one day I was studying for a chemistry test, and I hated chemistry, and I was ticking a lot. I had to suppress a lot in that class, so I didn't understand a lot of what was going on. So it was all kind of a blur to me. But I was studying for my chemistry test, and I was ticking a lot, and I was having a lot of tics. And my dad was like, "Okay, you can stop being stupid now, Shahara." And I was like, and that made me tick more. And then he got off his chair and then came to me and he said, "Shahara, if you don't stop being stupid, if you don't stop doing that, I'm going to leave. Do you want me to leave? Do you want me to pull you out of?" And then he stopped because he would have said curling. And I did really enjoy curling. And I guess he didn't want to ruin that. And that was very hard on me, having my father threaten to leave, which was very interesting as something that I didn't think I'd have to deal with until I started exhibiting tics. And I remember crying so much that I started laughing. I think that was just my body's natural way of picking myself up after that.
Yeah, I
But
relate to that. Yeah.
yeah, it's so weird. I was crying for a long time, and then I started like I just couldn't stop laughing. And I'm not a Zen person or I'm not a very
Yeah.
spiritual person, but I think that that's like what my body needed in a way. And since then,
Yeah.
my dad has come around. He came with me at my first support meeting, and that experience kind of scared him straight in a way because everyone at that meeting had tics, and I guess he'd never seen anyone else with tics similar to mine, and that experience really made him come around. So he's one of my big supporters, and told the staff at
Oh.
my curling, "Oh, she has Tourette syndrome." And they were like, "Really? I couldn't even tell." And I was like, "Well, if you're on the rink and you're hearing high-pitched screaming, that's what that is."
Wow. So that's amazing because that kind of swings from, I can see the way you're describing the sort of like strengths and weaknesses and the perception of that. And his daughter having something that is quote unquote abnormal, that may be perceived as a weakness within the family. And
Yeah.
then being exposed to it and having that awareness, and then seeing you for how strong you are and how you compose yourself. I don't want to put words in your mouth or I don't want to, revise the experience, but that's just kind of what I'm getting from what you're saying, is that he ultimately saw how strong of a person you were and became proud of you and became an advocate for you. Is that kind of right?
Yeah, and just kind of
That's
realizing
awesome.
that I'm still the same old Shahara. I'm still my school prime minister, no matter what. I still do well in school despite the tics. And yes, I have a hard time in school, and I need accommodations in school. But I'm still the same old Shahara. It's the same me.
Yeah, that's so cool. That is such a good story. I love that, because there are plenty of times where I hear from people who don't have the family support they need, and maybe aren't viewed so fairly, and it just makes me want to hope that this is going to be the kind of outcome to where they do finally get recognized for how strong they are for having something like this, dealing with it. But being your school prime minister, I mean, that's a huge mark of success for you, and is very promising for your future. And having something like TS, where maybe from the outside someone could view it as a weakness that's going to slow you down in life or something like that, or make it so you're not viable, that's off the table because you've already been kind of cutting through that. And even though it's something you still deal with, and your tics have gotten worse over the years, you're still on the right path, and you're doing what you need to do. And
exactly,
he sees that, he becomes a proud advocate for you. I love that story so much.
I couldn't ask for anything more, honestly.
We'll be right back. The Tourette Association of America is the premier nonprofit working to raise awareness, advance research, and provide ongoing support to those with Tourette syndrome or tic disorder. With a network of over 130 chapters, support groups, and centers of excellence, the TAA engages with communities across the nation in an effort to provide tools, webinars, workshops, and support for all seeking assistance. As a primary sponsor of Tourette's podcast, the TAA supports the authentic conversations showcasing the diverse representation of the TS community. To learn more, visit Tourette.org, TOURETTE.org.
So yeah.
I got to ask, curling, do you have the broom, or are you the person who throws the...
Yeah. That is so funny. Okay. Everyone in curling has a broom.
Yeah.
Everyone throws the rock 2 times. 4 people
Gotcha.
on a team. 4 times 2 is 8. 4 times 2 is 8. Okay, this is the thing. I'm bad at math, and I try to do math, and it doesn't work.
I doubt my math every time I do it. Even the simplest stuff, I have to go back and count on my fingers.
Okay, I believe 16 rocks are thrown in the game because there are 2 teams, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you have to try to see which one gets most in the center. But everyone holds a broom, but 3 out of 4 people will sweep because the person that doesn't sweep is the skip who tells you where the rock should be. So yeah,
Okay.
I hope that was good.
I enjoy curling when I see it on TV. I know nothing about it.
Exactly.
But it looks like, especially if you're doing the sweeping thing, it looks like such kind of a hyper expression that
It's like a dance.
Yeah. It seems like kind of the perfect outlet if you want to kind of blow off some steam and maybe detract some energy from your tics. Do you tick when you're doing that, or is this kind of like a zone away from tics?
I've yet to find something that makes my tics go away entirely.
Yeah.
There are some things that I do that make them a lot less. Like I paint, I play instruments, and I do makeup. I've started doing makeup, and I find that when I'm trying to concentrate on my face, I don't tick as much, and it's not like they go away entirely. And I can't really see myself not ticking at all.
Mm-hmm.
But finding those things have really helped. The things that I enjoy help me cope with everything.
It's like this is my unscientific take on it, and I have no idea what the scientists listening to this are that they might laugh and say, "Oh, dude, no, you're so off base with this. Like we already have science on this." But it seems like tics themselves are kind of like an expression, and they have a feeling of expression. You're getting something out, and there's a feeling of accomplishment with it, even if it is something you have to kind of like keep doing in repetition. And within the Tourette community, there's so much creativity and so many people who do a creative activity like, playing drums or painting or doing music or something like that. Will say that their tics aren't bothering them quite as much when they're doing that, or their tics seem to just kind of go away or disappear. And it seems like the common denominator with all that is expression. And again, that's my total unscientific take on how all this works, because I don't know. But it really is something to talk about, that within the Tourette community, art and creativity and expression is such a thing. And you're a really talented person. I mean,
thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Yeah. I mean, is that something you discovered about yourself, or have you been kind of a creative as long as you could remember?
I mean, I've loved singing for as long as I can remember. In middle school, I started playing the saxophone.
Cool.
And instruments and music have always been something that I've enjoyed doing with my free time.
Yeah.
I think that as I started having a harder time with what I was dealing with, those things, this is like my advice to anyone who has tics, is to find those things in your life that you take pleasure in and just run with it.
Yeah.
That's the best thing, because that's in the end what's gonna help you, save you, whatever it needs to do for you. Like another thing that helped me get through was RuPaul's Drag Race. And kind of understanding and learning about the queens, learning everything. And I think that there are messages underneath all the drag of that show that I've learned to live. Like I've kind of used as like my mantras in a way to get through. And like I said, I'm not a Zen person. I'm not a spiritual person, but I think like little sayings like, there's a concept in RuPaul's Drag Race called your inner saboteur, which is the like voice or the evil voice demon in your head that wants to bring you down.
Yeah.
And what are you going to do to beat that inner saboteur, right?
RuPaul is kind of like a global treasure, I think.
Of course.
What was it RuPaul said about the moment that I think this was in the masterclass, the RuPaul masterclass or something, but the quote was that the moment you stop worrying about what other people think of you, that's when you finally achieve.
Whatever somebody thinks of me is none of my goddamn business.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's something that I've learned to because I wrote the human rubberneck. Like I get stared at all the time.
Yeah, that was such a good piece, by the way. Let me go ahead and explain that for the audience. At tourettespodcast.com, we have people who submit blog stories, and Hara submitted one about the concept of the rubberneck and when you're something to behold. And and just kind of having to go through that. And it was a really beautifully written piece and really popular. And anyway, just had to tell the listeners that. Go ahead.
Do you have a good rubberneck story of like when you like had a weird tick and then like people were staring at you? Or like, what is your like weirdest tick story?
A lot of them, just because I was so extremely self-conscious of this stuff when I was little.
Yeah.
I focus so much time and attention on making sure that people didn't rubberneck and didn't notice things about me. So I would kind of make a production out of my tics, and if I had tics, I would kind of build this structure around the tics to make them look less conspicuous. Or if it's something that people did notice, they wouldn't notice it as a tic. It would just be something that looked more normal, like I was just having a coughing fit for a second, or I was stretching, or just something to make it look more normal. And really laborious over the years of making sure that people didn't notice. So a lot of the stories of people kind of talking about it, or kind of noticing and mocking my tics or mimicking my tics kind of go back to when I was younger. But there were some times in my 20s where I do remember I had this eye widening tic where I would widen my eyes and look left and right, like with my, like eyelids kind of like pulled wide open.
Surprised almost.
Yeah, surprised. And then it kind of looks kind of cartoony and creepy because I would shoot my eyes to the left and right. And I did notice people I was hanging out with pick up on that. And I could see out of my peripheral vision, they would look at each other and do that tick to each other to kind of like, hey, I saw it. He did that tick again, So kind of being made fun of in that respect. But a lot of the stories of me being kind of rubbernecked on were when I was younger, playing soccer, parents, kind of looking at each other and looking back at me and asking or talking to each other about what was wrong. That
like,
sort of thing.
Did you see that? Was I imagining that kind of?
Yeah. Just stuff like that. And it's really shameful. It makes you feel bad, and people don't necessarily have the polite filter that they need to have, because if they really did think that something was wrong with me and they needed to intervene, then maybe they would have asked me about it instead of just kind of like.
Yeah.
And
I've had people come up in public and be like, "Oh, sweetie, are you okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm just doing my thing."
Yeah. And it's like, I guess you have to take that when it happens as, hopefully this person was sincerely concerned and they had good faith in coming up to me. But if it's other people who are just like, I got to figure out what's going on with this girl, that's not as cool.
Yeah, like trying to, let me go up to her and try to solve her problems. I think
Or satisfy my own curiosity so I can tell my friends about it later.
Is huge, 100%.
Yeah.
Because it does make for a good story sometimes. Oh, I saw this kid and I just asked her if she was okay, and she said yeah, but she was kind of. I had an incident at. Do you know? It's a Metro. Do you know what a Metro is? It's a superstore.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
Yeah, I could just say I had an issue at a supermarket. I went to my local superstore, and I was wearing my mask. I was wearing my gloves. It's the first time that I'd been in a superstore in a long time. And I was having a kind of like a tick fit. I don't know if it was because I was nervous that I was like in public for the first time again. COVID kind of gave me fuck off. COVID gave me kind of a break from having to be in public so much, which was kind of nice. Of course, it kind of feeds into my avoidant behavior of not wanting to go out in public and people seeing me. But I went to the superstore with my mom for the first time in a while, and I was having a lot of tics. I was screaming a lot of weird coprololic stuff, like I have 12 titties. Very fun. I was just having screaming tics. I was just like screaming, which is fun. But after we cashed out, and I feel as though the most populous area in a supermarket is the cashier area.
Yeah.
And before I left, I just felt a huge premonitory urge, like through my body, and I screamed, "I have coronavirus!" And I mean, the looks of people, you could see their eyes through the masks, and oh my gosh.
Oh, man.
Nobody came up to me, luckily. Nobody in hazmat suits came like rushing in or anything. But I have to look
picking
at
you
it
up
with humor
sideways and running off with you.
100%. Nobody put me in like a plastic chamber or nothing. I lived, but it was just it was interesting playing badminton of like swinging away the looks that I was getting.
Wow. Well, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, what was the reaction? Did you say anything to follow up? Is like, oh, I didn't mean that, or
No. And you know what? I've built up a don't apologize for your tics thing, because I used to have
good for
like
you.
I used to build them in. I'd say like fuck you, sorry. Like I'd build the sorry into the tic, because I was just apologizing so much, not just because I'm Canadian, but like because I just felt the need to sorry for every tic I had. And I was like, no, I really shouldn't, because if I said sorry for every single time I tick, and I tick like 3 times every, like or like once every 5 seconds, oh my god, I'd be ticking and swearing and sorrying a lot, you know?
Yeah, and that's pretty laborious too. There's a fellow Canadian of yours named Shane Fistel, who was actually really important to me when I was a little kid, and he had a piece in the New York Times. This is a long time ago, I think now at this point, but it was a perspective piece, and I think the title of it was "I Won't Live a Life of Apologizing," and it was really powerful and important, and just kind of. He did a good job of pulling people into his shoes so you could understand what it is kind of he goes through, and you know, like, yeah, there may be something that is, I guess, kind of by definition disruptive that he might do, but imagine if Tourette had the portrayal that maybe it should have, and maybe people were a little bit more ready for that kind of thing, and you know, I don't expect the public to be expert about TS and know inside and out, you know, what it is, but I do expect the public to be a little bit more empathetic and kind of slowing down their judgment, as we were talking about at the beginning of this conversation.
Of course. And I wish that everyone had the portrayals of Tourette syndrome that we see in front of the class in Motherless Brooklyn. Like, those movies were insane. I got those because of the Tourette podcast, because I listened to it so much.
Oh, cool.
I watched Front of the Class last week, and I'm not kidding. I cried 3 times.
Oh, man.
I was dying of laughter 2 times. It was such a moving movie, and because a lot of the experiences that Brad Cohen talks about, or that his character in the movie goes through, I mean, I was like, that was me. That's me. I've had those stuff said to me before. Having those kind of portrayals is so important. Not just for people fuck off with Tourette's to see, because we can find relatability from that, but from neurotypicals as well, because that's where they get the education from.
And that's why I was glad that Motherless Brooklyn, even though, you know, I think, as I said at the time, I don't know what a perfect Tourette portrayal looks like, you know, and you know, at the beginning, I've heard some people say that the way he ticks, the way Ed Norton ticks at the beginning is a little bit overwrought, and they may be trying too hard to establish it or something. Again, I don't know. I don't know what a perfect Tourette portrayal looks like, because there's a lot of diversity within Tourette syndrome. But I was really glad to see a movie that had sort of the mainstream thrust that it had, especially with respectable actors like Ed Norton, and the diversity of the cast. And there were so many important things that occurred within the production of that movie. And if it has sort of that appeal or that value, it's not directed at the Tourette community. It's directed at a general audience. And the way that he kind of acquitted himself in so many of those scenes of, it's just this thing I got, and he would go right back to business and be
interesting about his characters that he didn't have the language to talk about what he was going through.
Exactly. Yeah.
And even characters were asking, well, what is that? And he was like, it's just a thing my brain does. And he didn't, in the book, he knows it's Tourette syndrome. Like, he says, like, my Tourettic brain. But in the movie, because it was taking place in the 1950s era, he didn't have that same language. So it's interesting how the 2 versions of the same character were dealing with that.
Yeah. And the way he would just kind of, he wouldn't let sort of their curiosities and questions about what's wrong with him detract him from the task at hand or what he was trying to do. He would stay on it, and he would sort of let his talents kind of define who he was versus the fact that he's a little bit weird, or however you want to put it.
Mm-hmm. And even the character that played Moses, Randolph, said, "You come across as weird, but you're smart." So that defines. I think that defines a lot of us.
Someone almost almost verbatim said that to me one time.
Really?
My friend Matt in Wilmington, it was like 2 a.m. or something. We were talking, and he said that line almost exactly that to me.
Wow.
So, with you being the prime minister of your class, and there's a degree of being kind of out front and center with that. What do people know about you? Do people know that you have TS, or are people aware of that being the diagnosis, or how do people regard you?
When I was in school finishing off grade 12 before COVID, I was very, very nervous. I had pretty bad Tourette syndrome, and I was suppressing all the time, except for in front of my friends. My friends knew. Because that's the only time, like lunchtime would be my time to just get that release out. And my teachers in my second semester knew. So I was even hiding it from my first semester teachers, even though I knew. Second semester, I couldn't suppress that much anymore because I think my brain was just so exhausted. But I'm sure my counsel realized that there was something odd, and I always carry a fidget toy around usually, because a lot of my anxiety manifests I find in like my hands, and I pull my fingers a lot. Woo! So that's kind of a tell as well. But I guess they could tell that I was having tics. I'm not sure if they knew that I had Tourette syndrome, and if I could redo this year, or maybe if COVID hadn't happened, maybe I would have been more open. I was having a lot of anxiety about having that standing at the front of the class situation, and kind of saying I have Tourette syndrome. My classmates and my counsel definitely knew I had tics. It's kind of the elephant in the room that we're not going to talk about.
Yeah.
But that's they know. I think they know me more as like Hara is like very hopefully they think I'm smart, smart and
I'm sure they do.
Caring. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I think that I've built myself as a leader in my school to an extent where it doesn't matter like if I am weird, I am naturally quirky as well. But despite that, I can lead a good council and I can run events really well, and that's what it comes down to.
Where are you going? Like, what's ahead for you?
I've had to change that a lot. I thought that I wanted to be like a general. I thought I wanted to be a surgeon, and then I was like, well, I know there is a doctor in Toronto, a surgeon who has Tourette syndrome. His name is Morton Duran. He's really cool. I've heard, and I've been on a Zoom call with him, which is really cool.
Oh, that's cool.
But I had to change a bit as to what I wanted to do, especially since like my chemistry mark was really bad, and I was trying to like, oh shoot, what can I do? And I realized that having Tourette syndrome, people are gonna look at me differently, and I think that's something that I haven't thought about a lot. But right now I want to go into behavioral sciences. I'm going into social sciences at McMaster University, which is a university in Canada.
Nice.
And I want to specialize in psychology, neurology, behavior. And I know that I just know that I want to work with people with autism and Tourette syndrome. That's what I want to guide my studies towards. So.
Oh, that's so cool. That's amazing. I mean, and sort of tracing back through your history and with your family and everything like that. I mean, it's really cool that you're able to kind of circle back, and this thing that was kind of the perceived weakness is something that you can really build a successful life around.
And that's what I'm trying to do as much as I can, because I want to work with the strengths that I have, and what I am interested in. And I'm interested in the condition that I have. I'm interested in learning about other people's ways that they deal with the same condition. That's interesting to me, and that's what I kind of want to run with.
So, one thing I like to ask people from time to time what their favorite analogies are, to kind of convey what it is like to live your life and have Tourette syndrome. and the feeling of ticking and the one of keep your eyes open and try not to blink or whatever, or holding in a sneeze. Do you have any analogies that are on your mind to kind of help people relate?
I used to say for my high school friends that are also teenagers, that it's kind of like being a rag doll controlled by a 9-year-old Mussolini. It makes you hit yourself and maybe hit others. You can come across as rude sometimes. The sneezing analogy also. Suppressing tics is hard. It's like holding in your pee. Eventually you have to pee, but you just kind of hold in, which is very gross, which I don't use a lot anymore. I said it to my sister and she was like,
everybody
that's gross.
relates.
And I'm like, yeah, it is gross. So yeah, I think that whatever way that you can get people to understand your experience is the one that works for you. Yeah, whatever works for you is the best way to do it.
So for people listening who may be in the same situation you were in when you were younger and, kind of a clear path to a diagnosis and acceptance and all that, wasn't quite as present as you had hoped. I mean, do you have any advice for maybe people who were 12, 13, they're at a kind of a sensitive transition age and, maybe there isn't quite the level of acceptance that they would like with their TS. I mean, do you have any sort of thoughts or advice for people who, kind of hope to be where you are now?
Yeah. And I by no means think I'm any kind of a difference, or I don't know if it's like a success story. Like I don't want, because there is a lot of things I'm still learning to deal with. I do still have a hard time. And I think that that's something that is always going to keeps building on through life. You kind of learn how to deal with things that you deal with. And it's kind of refinery almost. You learn to refine the things that you say to people. Like at the beginning, it was difficult to self-advocate. I had to learn how to self-advocate really quickly. And I would just be like, oh, I have Tourette's. But then you start being like, okay, well, it's Tourette's. It's a neurological condition. I have OCD, anxiety. Like these are things that are along with it. You learn to kind of refine the way that you talk about stuff. Staying true to yourself is number one. Like no matter what, if people were like, why don't you just say that stuff in your head? Or you don't listen to what I'm saying, just try not to do that. Staying true to myself was one thing that really helped with my going through high school sane, because I was like, well, this is a neurological condition that I can't control, and even if I try to, I eventually have to get the tics out somewhere. So staying true to yourself and having knowledge in that skill set is really important. I have a Tourette Syndrome ID card, just in case, but sometimes I have it in my wallet, but sometimes I don't carry my wallet. And if somebody asks me what's happening and I don't have my ID card, I'm like, well, the next thing I have is knowledge. Knowledge is number one.
Yeah.
And being able to educate others on what you're going through and what you're experiencing. I'm an oversharer. Sometimes I overshare a lot. So maybe I'll be swearing and I'm like, oh, only 15% of people have coprolalia, and it's very common. And my psychologist was like, well, sometimes you don't even need to go that far. You can just say, oh, sorry, I have Tourette syndrome, and they'll probably understand. And if you need it, then you have that knowledge behind your back.
Yeah, the Lionel approach.
The Lionel approach, exactly. And if you, I said it before, but find what you're good at and run with it, and find the people who will support you. If you're not finding it from your friends, if you don't have a lot of friends, you could go to teachers. If you don't have teachers, maybe you have it at home. If you're not at home, then find support groups. I'm in 5 different support groups right now, which might sound insane, but they do really help me. Yeah. And I feel less alone. And I also found the Tourette podcast, which was like, I was looking for answers anywhere. I was like, wow, I feel like the only person in the entire universe with Tourette syndrome, and I'm having a hard time. Where can I find support? And that's how I was on the Tourette.org website, and I scrolled down and I saw Tourette podcast, and I'm like, this is sick. This is awesome. This is what I've been looking for. And yeah, the fact that I'm like even talking to you was like, whoa. This is cool.
No, I really appreciate it. And I really like the way you worded that of, just kind of know thyself and what other people think about the truth doesn't affect what the truth is, and if you do accept what you are, who you are, I mean, and you can kind of focus on that and kind of leave the bandwidth for what you're good at. I mean, that seems to be the key. And it's way more difficult than said, but finding community like you have found, I think is really the best motivator. Because you feel a bit more safe, and I know I do. I could doubt myself a lot. I know.
Fuck off, COVID.
So I was a reporter for a long time, and
which is the coolest thing to me. I love that.
Yeah,
That's so cool.
It really is a fantastic job because it teaches you a little bit about everything, and you have to go into uncomfortable situations and learn how to kind of take your emotion out of it and write it straight. But one thing I was always really, really self-conscious of was at press conferences and the kinds of questions I was asking. And I would worry that, would other reporters think I'm asking a stupid question? And then over time, that just kind of faded off. And I was like, I just want to know what I need to know to write the story accurately. And so I would just start asking questions, and I would be very happy with the stories. I would be very satisfied, I guess, with what I was writing because I worried about the external stuff a lot less. And same thing with the podcast. It's like, maybe at first I might have worried that, like, oh God, that was a dumb question. Why did I ask that? But now it's like just having a conversation and thinking about how conversations go. Just kind of ask what you're curious about. And like, I'm not trying to be offensive. I know you're not trying to be offensive. We're just trying to talk. And, so just casting off the self-consciousness and focusing on, what you know about yourself and what you still want to learn is so important. And we haven't talked about that enough on the podcast.
I think it goes perfectly what you're saying with that idea of investing in our worry bank or an anxiety bank. Before coming on, like for days, I was like turning in my sleep because I was like, what if I call him sir and he'll be like offended? Or what if I say something and he won't even air the episode? Like, I think that we invest in our worry banks to safeguard us a bit. But the thing with anxiety, fuck off, is that sometimes we run a little too far with it. And I'm very good at that. People with Tourette brains are very good at that, I think.
Yep.
It's just learning what is a realistic worry and what is an unrealistic worry. And that's kind of what I'm working on with my psychologist now. I did not come with this myself, but skills.
There's always work to do.
Exactly.
Well, Hara, this has been so great. Like, I really, really appreciate you taking time to talk. I mean,
thank you for talking to me. Oh my God, thank you.
No, this has been a pleasure. I feel like we've hit some points that we haven't hit on the podcast before, and that's another thing I'm always self-conscious of. Like, am I just kind of turning over the same rocks again and again? But it's been really nice to hear your perspective, and there's a lot of stuff we heard that was fresh, I think. I'm really appreciative of you.
Yeah, no, thank you for taking the time with me. I know that a lot of, having teens on the podcast is something that I've really wanted, and now that we're doing that, I'm just so excited that I get to be a part of it. So I appreciate that a lot.
More teens in the future. You spoke, so.
Yes! Yes, I'm excited for that. I'm looking forward to it. Hey Ben, just following our conversation, there's one section where I was trying to find a word around where we were talking about the different lenses of adversity that help us in the end walk through the world, whether that be a queer lens or a person of color lens or somebody with a disability or Tourette's lens. The word completely left me. I could find myself kind of going through the Rolodex in my mind trying to figure out what the word was, and it came to me the second we got off the call. And that word was intersectionality. The reality is, intersectionalities exist, no matter the community. I mean, during Pride Month, the Tourette Association of America did an amazing job highlighting this and continuing to highlight the stories of those who fit into those various intersectionalities. Sometimes we even see intersectionalities, or rather isms, within communities. I mean, coming from the South Asian background I come from, colorism is huge. And in the LGBTQ community, racism and sexism is huge. It's not easy being different. But through living in a world through the lens of adversity, you learn to be strong, to be more accepting and open-minded, and to find ways of letting people, just for a moment, understand what you're going through. And I believe that is ever present in the creative and intricate minds of those with Tourette syndrome. Just wanted to share that final thought. Thank you very much, and I hope you have a great day.
Thanks for listening. Thanks so much to Hara for taking the time and sharing her story. There was a lot in there, and I have a feeling this is one of those episodes you could just play again and again and still catch something new. I know the intro was a little bit short this week. You'll recall me talking about how blazingly hot it is right now in the podcast studio, where an HVAC repairman is soon to give me some bad news. So I'm keeping it short here so I can get back into the air conditioning. Tourette'sPodcast.com for all past episodes. You can also find them at geeksrising.com, the wonderful podcast network that brings Tourette's Podcast to a bigger listening audience. Thanks to Geeks Rising, and shout out to all the non-Touretters listening. Tourette.org is the website of the Tourette Association of America, the primary sponsor of Tourette's Podcast, and really the people making the podcast possible to begin with now. Megan, Amanda, Diana, Leo, and company, really cool people running the Tourette Association. Thanks to Sophia, who's brought the Tourette's Podcast discussion group into a membership of several hundred. Join the Tourette's Podcast discussion group on Facebook for the next level of conversation about the podcast or anything else. I'm about to dunk my head into a bucket of ice, so I'll be on the web in the meantime if you want to reach out, tourettespodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and stay cool. This is Ben.